In this episode, we're going to focus on one of the most important skills in security work that beginners often underestimate: writing findings that actually help people fix problems. It is easy to think the hard part is discovering an issue, like spotting a weakness in access controls or noticing a risky configuration, but discovery is only half the job. A finding is the bridge between what you observed and what the organization will do next, and if that bridge is weak, the work stalls even if the technical discovery was strong. A well-written finding tells a clear story in a way that different audiences can understand, including technical staff who will remediate and leaders who decide priorities. It also protects accuracy because it forces you to be precise about what happened, what evidence supports it, and what the real consequences are. When you write better findings, you increase the odds that the right fix happens quickly, that the fix is complete rather than superficial, and that the organization learns something lasting instead of just patching a symptom. The first building block is severity, because severity is how you communicate urgency without turning everything into a fire drill. Severity is not a feeling, and it is not about how scary a weakness sounds. It is a reasoned estimate of risk based on how likely exploitation is and how damaging exploitation would be. Likelihood is influenced by factors like exposure, ease of abuse, and whether the weakness can be reached by an attacker with realistic access. Impact is influenced by what could be harmed, such as confidentiality, integrity, or availability, and how broadly the damage could spread. For beginners, it helps to think of severity as a decision support label that helps the reader allocate scarce time, not as a badge of drama. If you inflate severity, people learn to distrust your reports, and if you understate severity, serious risks linger. The goal is consistency and transparency, so a reader can see the logic behind the rating and agree that it matches the facts you present. A practical way to keep severity grounded is to separate conditions from consequences and to avoid assuming the worst case unless your evidence supports it. Conditions include how an attacker would reach the weakness, what privileges they would need, and what barriers exist, such as authentication, segmentation, or monitoring. Consequences include what the attacker could do after exploiting it, not what they might do in a fictional scenario, but what your test or observation indicates is realistically possible. If the weakness is exposed to the public internet and requires no authentication, the likelihood is generally higher than if it is internal only and requires a specialized role. If exploitation could lead to full control of a critical system or access to sensitive data, the impact is generally higher than if it leads to a minor information disclosure. When you explicitly connect conditions to consequences, your severity choice feels like a conclusion rather than an opinion. Even when you use a formal rating approach, your narrative matters because it explains why the rating makes sense to someone who does not live inside the details. Evidence is the next building block, and it is where many findings fall apart because writers either include too little or include too much without clarity. Evidence is what proves the finding is real, repeatable, and within the scope of what you were allowed to examine. Good evidence includes specific observations, such as what system was affected, what control failed, and what result you obtained, and it does so without dumping raw data that confuses the reader. Evidence should be detailed enough that a technical team can reproduce the issue, confirm it is fixed later, and understand whether similar systems might share the same weakness. At the same time, evidence should be handled responsibly, because you do not want to spread sensitive data by copying it into a report unnecessarily. For example, if you can prove unauthorized access by showing that you reached a sensitive record, you generally do not need to include the entire record to make the point. The discipline is to capture what is necessary to prove the claim and nothing extra that increases risk. A useful habit is to write evidence as a clear chain of facts, where each sentence supports the next, and the reader can follow without guessing what you mean. Start with what asset or context was tested, then what action was taken, then what response occurred, and finally what that response demonstrates. Precision matters, because vague phrases like "it appears vulnerable" or "might be exploitable" create uncertainty that makes remediation slower. If you do not know something, it is better to state the limit clearly, such as access was observed for this specific role under these conditions, rather than implying it is universally exploitable. Another common mistake is mixing evidence with conclusions, where a writer starts interpreting before the reader has seen the facts. If you present the facts first, then interpret them, you build trust. That trust is critical because people decide whether to act on a finding based on whether they believe it, and belief comes from evidence that is easy to understand and hard to dispute. Impact is closely related to severity, but it deserves its own attention because impact is where you translate technical outcomes into real-world consequences. Impact is not just what happened during testing. It is what could happen if the weakness were exploited by someone with harmful intent. The difference is important because many ethical tests stop at the minimum proof, so you might not fully demonstrate every downstream effect. Your job is to connect the demonstrated capability to plausible consequences without exaggeration. If you gained access to a limited dataset, impact might include unauthorized exposure of personal information, compliance risk, and reputational harm, but you should tie that to what kind of data it was and why that data matters. If you demonstrated that a system can be modified without authorization, impact might include integrity loss, fraud, or operational disruption, but again, you should tie that to what the system controls. Good impact writing answers the reader's unspoken question, which is so what, and it does it in language that is understandable beyond the security team. A beginner-friendly way to write impact well is to align it with the classic security goals of confidentiality, integrity, and availability. Then describe consequences in each area that are supported by your evidence. Confidentiality is about unauthorized viewing of data, so describe what data types are at risk and why exposure would matter. Integrity is about unauthorized changes, so describe what could be altered and what business outcomes might follow, such as incorrect decisions or fraudulent transactions. Availability is about disruption, so describe what services could be interrupted and what that would mean for users, revenue, or safety. You do not need to cover all three every time, because some findings primarily affect one area, but using this lens keeps your impact grounded and complete. It also helps avoid vague impact statements like could lead to compromise, which sound serious but do not help a reader understand what is actually at stake. When impact is written with clarity, severity becomes easier to justify, and remediation becomes easier to prioritize. Actionable remediation logic is the part that turns a finding from a problem statement into a solution pathway, and it is where you can have the biggest influence on outcomes. Beginners often write remediation as a generic sentence like patch the system or implement best practices, but that does not help the people who must make the change. Actionable remediation explains what control should exist, why it reduces risk, and what a reasonable next step looks like without being a step-by-step configuration guide. It should also acknowledge trade-offs, because in real environments you cannot always take the most extreme fix, like disabling a service entirely, without breaking business needs. Good remediation also differentiates between immediate mitigation and long-term correction. Mitigation might be a temporary control that reduces exposure quickly, while correction is the deeper change that removes the root cause or strengthens the design so the issue does not come back. To make remediation logic truly useful, connect it directly to how the weakness was possible in the first place. If the issue exists because an account has overly broad permissions, remediation should focus on least privilege, role design, and review processes, not just on one account change that might be reversed later. If the issue exists because a system is exposed more widely than intended, remediation should focus on exposure reduction, segmentation, and access controls, not just on hoping monitoring will catch abuse. If the issue exists because a control is missing, remediation should specify the missing control category, such as authentication, input validation, encryption, or logging, and describe what success looks like after it is implemented. A strong finding also suggests validation, meaning how the organization can confirm the fix worked and did not introduce a new problem. That validation does not need to be technical instructions. It can be a clear statement of expected outcomes, like access should be denied under previously successful conditions and attempts should be visible in monitoring. Another important piece of writing better findings is thinking about the audience and using language that is precise without being overly technical. Your technical peers might enjoy deep details, but your report should be understandable to the people who will own the fix, approve the fix, and verify the fix. That means defining unfamiliar terms briefly, avoiding jargon when a plain word works, and keeping sentences focused. It also means being careful with absolute statements, because security is often conditional. Instead of saying the system is insecure, say the system allows unauthorized access under these conditions, because that is a claim you can prove and that is easier to fix. A finding should also avoid blame, because blame leads to defensiveness and delays, while clear facts lead to action. The goal is not to embarrass a team. The goal is to reduce risk. When you write with a neutral, evidence-first tone, people are more likely to collaborate with you rather than argue with you. Clarity also comes from structure inside the paragraph flow of a finding, even when you are not using headings or lists. In your mind, you want a consistent order: what the issue is, how you know it is real, why it matters, and what to do about it. If you jump between these ideas, readers get lost, and you create unnecessary debate about what you meant. Another common pitfall is writing conclusions that are broader than your evidence supports, like claiming full compromise when you only demonstrated limited access. Being careful here is not weakness, it is professional discipline. When you stay within what you can support, your credibility rises, and readers are more likely to accept your higher severity claims when they truly apply. Over time, that credibility becomes one of the most valuable outcomes of your work, because organizations respond fastest to writers they trust. Writing better findings is not just writing. It is building a reliable signal in a world full of noise. Finally, it helps to see findings as part of a feedback loop rather than a one-time report, because the best security improvements come from learning that repeats. A finding that includes thoughtful severity reasoning, clear evidence, well-explained impact, and actionable remediation logic can be used later to verify fixes, train teams, and spot patterns across systems. Over time, organizations can compare findings to see recurring root causes, like permission sprawl, weak change control, or missing logging, and then invest in systemic improvements. That is how a collection of findings becomes a stronger security program rather than a stack of disconnected problems. As a beginner, if you develop the habit of writing findings as decision-ready documents, you will stand out quickly, because many people can identify an issue, but fewer can communicate it in a way that drives correct action. The goal is always the same: make the next step obvious, make the risk understandable, and make the fix realistic. When you can do that consistently, your findings stop being a report and start being a tool that changes outcomes.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.